Hello everyone, Board Observer here. I wanted to share with you a conversation I had online with someone who supported Antifa. For those of you who don't know, Antifa stands for anti-fascists. She was adamant that Antifa fights fascism. I said that they didn't because they used fascistic tactics to obtain their goals.
I think the people watching tonight should look at the people protesting and look at what color hat they're wearing. It's certainly not red.
Are you surprised, ma'am?
But in Berkeley, we made sure that didn't happen because we were able to shut him down.
So, but you're conceding that Milo himself has not committed acts of violence, and nor has he incited violence by the legal definition. He'd be in jail if he did. But you're saying that because people who agree with him have committed violence, he should not be allowed to speak.
You know, fascist movement takes many forms, and it always tries to have one form that looks respectable and a little bit milder. But Yiannopoulos isn't just a stand-up comedian, and he isn't someone who just has ideas and posts them up on YouTube. He's someone who is funded by Breitbart and Steve Bannon to go around to college campuses to try to recruit other young people to then conduct those attacks on his behalf and on Trump's behalf. But I'm really, really glad to say that thousands of us were out there last week, or February 1st, and made sure that there were thousands of us to make sure that we defended our campus, this community, and especially the immigrant and Muslim students who were under attack and have been under attack by him and other fascists.
Right, and by using violence, I mean, you don't shy away from that by any means necessary is the name of your group, and so it implies violence. So what should we do with fascists? I mean, if you think that someone is espousing genocide, what should we do with them? I mean, should that person be allowed to walk free? Should we put him in jail? Should we kill him? Should we exile him? I mean, it's a sincere question. If you're willing to use violence because you think someone is espousing genocide, what's the penalty for that?
Well, first we've got to make sure we nip it in the bud, and we make sure that they're not allowed to recruit and act as if it's respectable to call for the mass murder of millions of people, in fact, millions who make up the majority of people in this nation at this point.
Okay,
and so they
just
can't
to be
hide
clear,
behind the
there's no
platform of free
Milo
speech.
Yiannopoulos, this is not a defense of him, just a factual point, has not ever said that, in public anyway, not that we have a record of. There's no evidence that he has called for the genocide of anybody, as you know, but you're saying by transference in some way, he inspires people who believe that, I guess. But you're not getting my question. Like, when you say nip in the bud, should he be allowed to go on the subway and talk to the guy next to him about perhaps joining his movement, or should he be allowed to talk to people in restaurants? Do you think, you're not answering my question, that people like Milo, who you've decided are fascists, should be allowed to speak in public? You said they weren't allowed to speak at Berkeley.
He should not be allowed to speak in public to spread his racist and misogynistic and homophobic lies. No, he does not have the right to do that.
A man captured on video bashing a Trump supporter over the head with a bike lock during this rally in Berkeley.
A vicious hit.
Bleeding. Yo. Hey, medic! He's bleeding. Hard.
A masked man swung a bike U-lock over a Trump supporter's head. The victim, in a red Sriracha hot sauce t-shirt, was playing peacemaker and trying to break up a confrontation. Police say the U-lock attacker is this man, 28-year-old Eric Clanton, a former part-time professor at Diablo Valley College.
And I told her I don't side with Nazis or communists. She stated proudly that communism is an economic system, not an ideology. At the moment, I knew that wasn't totally true, but I let it go. My brain had been replaying that encounter over and over. Then it hit me. Communism is not only an economic system, but it's also, and always, a political philosophy. Let me explain. By definition, communism is a political theory derived from Karl Marx, advocating class war and leading to a society in which all property is publicly owned and each person works and is paid according to their abilities and needs. Essentially, it's a conflict between the proletariat, the working class, and the bourgeoisie. Sounds straightforward, right? But what's the underlying theory that communism operates under? It's not necessarily the rich against the poor, it's power. It's the powerful versus the powerless, or what's perceived as the powerful versus the powerless. Now, so far I hadn't said anything that suggests that communism is nothing more than an economic and political philosophy. Pretty straightforward, right? Or so it would appear. Conflict theory has morphed into what is known as critical theory. Critical theory is a neo-Marxist philosophy developed out of the Frankfurt School in Germany. The core concepts of critical theory are as follows: that critical social theory should be directed at the totality of society and its historical specificity, i.e., how it came to be configured at a specific point in time. and that critical theory should improve the understanding of society by integrating it into all major social sciences, including geography, economics, sociology, history, political science, anthropology, and psychology. This social theory has spread to other forms of thought. One of them is postmodernism. Postmodernism, in a nutshell, is radical relativism. Postmodernism questions and sometimes tears down all grand narratives in society. A tool of postmodernism is deconstructionism. The notion of a deconstructive approach implies an analysis that questions the already evident understanding of a text in terms of presuppositions, ideological underpinnings, hierarchical values, and frames of reference. A deconstructive approach further depends on the technique of close reading without reference to culture, ideological, moral, or information derived from an authority over the text, such as the author. To a postmodernist, everything is relative, and nothing is more hierarchical than the other. In fact, hierarchies in society are only constructs of power and nothing else. Conflict theory has also birthed other social theories like critical race theory, queer theory, and feminist theory. Critical race theory is simply this: replace rich versus poor with people of color versus white. Feminist theory, simply replace rich versus poor with male versus female. Queer theory, simply replace rich versus poor with heterosexuality versus every other sexuality. Now, these are overly simplified definitions of these theories. There's way more nuance than what I'm presenting. What I'm giving you are working definitions so that you can view contemporary modern society through these definitions. And I'll concede that some of these theories have a lot of truth in them, but their remedies to the injustices they perceive are what's destructive. Critical theory, and all of its variations, questions and even opposes what they call neoliberalism, which, in a nutshell, is a more robust form of classical liberalism. They question and fight against the principles of the Enlightenment. Both of these theories value minimal state involvement and limitations to the following functions: a government to protect individual rights and to provide services that cannot be provided in a free market. A common national defense to provide protection against foreign and domestic invaders. Laws to provide protection for citizens from wrongs committed against them by other citizens, which includes the protection of private property. They also enforce contracts and common law. They also build and maintain public institutions and public works that included a stable currency, standard weights and measures, and building and upkeep of roads, canals, harbors, railways, communications, and postal services. Ugh. Now, you might be thinking that these values encompass many of the tenets of right-wing ideology, but you'd be incorrect. This ideology has room for left-wing ideology as well. No political ideology has a monopoly on classical liberalism. Critical theory also takes its aim against many of the principles of the Enlightenment. Ideas concerning God, reason, nature, and humanity were synthesized into a worldview that gained wide assent in the West and that instigated revolutionary developments in art, philosophy, and politics. Central to Enlightenment thought were the use and celebration of reason, the power by which humans understand the universe and improve their condition. The goals of rational humanity were considered to be knowledge, freedom, and happiness. Out of the Enlightenment came the separation of powers when it comes to government, a finer tuning of methodologies in science and mathematics. Atheism also sprung out of the Enlightenment, as did an evangelical-like version of Christianity. The Enlightenment encompasses a multitude of political ideologies, even some radical ideologies. So, how does this all play out in contemporary America? Put on the lens of critical theory, race, feminism, conflict, queer, and what do you see? Straight, white young men and their allies are the oppressors, and everyone else is the oppressed.
All white people are racist, all men are misogynistic, all cisgender people are transphobic.
For the sake of argument, straight white men have used their power to suppress racial, gender, and sexual minorities. The United States was found in part by white supremacy. Essentially, straight white rich young men weren't enlightened enough. If one were to truly believe in classical liberalism and Enlightenment values, then you can't possibly oppress other minorities. Historically, straight rich white young men kept others out of the arena of ideas. That's why figures like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. resonated with so many people. He told white America that they were not living up to the high standards set forth in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. He told segregated churches they were not being Christian enough. King used the values of Christianity and the Enlightenment to free a historically oppressed people. And that's what makes critical theory so toxic. It's a one-size-fits-all lens to view the world. Instead of breaking down the barriers that held historically oppressed people back from classical liberal and Enlightenment values, critical theory attacks the very foundation that these societies are built upon. When you deconstruct critical theory and its many variations, the ideas of the Enlightenment are simply tools of white supremacy. They must be torn down, not in the name of equality, but in the name of equity. Equity, in the context of conflict theory, means equal outcomes. There must be proportional representation of every historically oppressed persons throughout society. Why aren't there many women in STEM fields?
Patriarchy.
White patriarchy. Why aren't there more persons of color in high office?
That's racist!
White supremacy, etc. Instead of freeing people from their oppression, conflict theory handicaps people's perspective. If you see a person of color, you can only view them as an oppressed people.
A new student joining us. She just moved here all the way from Africa.
Welcome. I'm from Michigan. Great.
Even if this oppressed person has never experienced oppression in his or her life. And through the lens of conflict theory, the world system is a system of white supremacy that needs to be torn down. Conflict theory demands that you see the world through this lens. Otherwise, you are a tool of white supremacy. So how does conflict theory play out in the real world? Here are a few examples. The term racism has changed. It used to mean prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism directed against someone of a different race based on the belief that one's own race is superior. Now racism is prejudice plus power. Since people of color, women, and sexual minorities don't have quote-unquote power, they can't technically be racist, sexist, homophobic, etc. They might be bigoted, but they can't possess any of the aforementioned vices. Straight white, able-bodied men and right-of-center political ideology is inherently oppressive. Here's some examples. Candace Owens, a person who I have political reservations about, is a black conservative. Through conflict theory, she's a member of an oppressed class of people. However, her ideology is one of white supremacy. Therefore, her ideology trumps the color of her skin. She's basically white. Another example, Candace Owens again. Recently, the New York Times hired Sarah Jeong. Jeong has a history of making very anti-white tweets. Owens simply copied Jeong's tweets and replaced white with Jewish. As a result, Owens gets temporarily suspended from Twitter. Speaking of Sarah Jeong, she was able to make these tweets against white men because she was a minority of color. Therefore, any racial attack she makes against whites cannot constitute racism. But if you were to deconstruct her identity, she is a naturalized Korean woman who attended Berkeley and Harvard Law School. Even though she's a minority woman of color, she already has more privilege than most whites in the United States. On the flip side, black comedian Terrence K. Williams used some racist terminology against Sarah Jeong. As a black man, Williams can't be racist, right? According to conflict theory, but he's a Trump supporter. He is an ally of white supremacy. Therefore, he's basically white. Another example of conflict theory being played out in today's society is an event where African American cops were called the N-word by white Antifa members because they
fucking nigger to the white man.
They were viewed as race traitors. They have this notion that African American people must think a certain way and behave a certain way. And if they're cops, or if they're conservatives, or even if they're libertarians, they're not considered true African Americans. Speaking of conservative or libertarian African Americans, if there's any one class of people that are called more racist names in America, it is conservatives or libertarian African Americans, or even centrist African Americans. Their ideology is one of white supremacy. Thus, this cancels out their race. Conservative or libertarian LGBTQ, you have forfeited your moral authority. If you're a conservative or libertarian woman, you have forfeited your moral authority. Conflict theory has a lot to offer people if it's used correctly. There are many people of color that still suffer oppression and discrimination. But if it's the only lens people use to view the world, then individuals are always and forever assigned to their groups in the only way to social justice. Conflict theory demands that you submit not only to its ideology, but to its remedies of justice. Of course, it's anything but justice. It's an ideology of revenge. So, in closing, Marxism is indeed an economic system, but it's so much more than that. The social theory that undergirds it demands economic and social equity through the use of an authoritarian centralized government. And that's why I can't support communists.